In a church in Rome, there's a piece of wood that's been revered for hundreds of years. It's said to be one of the most important Christian relics ever found. Those who believe in it say it's a piece of the true cross, the cross Christ was crucified on.
For Christianity, it's a very important relic because it was hanging on the cross of Christ. It is an authentic relic of the true cross.
But is this piece of wood really part of Christ's cross? Is there any hard evidence to back the claim, or is it a fantasy?
The idea that all of this is necessarily ridiculous and medieval superstition and so on is something we should just suspend judgment on.
This is the story of one man's attempt to prove that the relic in Rome really is an authentic piece of the cross of Christ. Michael Hesseman is a historian. He specializes in religious history. For years, he's been on a quest. He wants to prove the authenticity of a piece of wood he believes is part of the original cross on which Christ was crucified. The so-called true cross.
It is the most important relic of Christianity because it is a silent witness of the crucifixion of our Lord.
Hesseman is not the first person to make such claims for a piece of wood. For hundreds of years, adventurers have brought back what they claim are samples of the true cross. There are dozens of fragments of wood purporting to be from Christ's crucifixion. But Hesseman believes his relic is very different from all the rest. The relic is housed in a church in Rome known as Santa Croce, or the Church of the Holy Cross. It's called the Titulus Crucis, literally the title of the cross. It's a fragment of a larger piece of wood, which, according to the Bible, was placed above the head of Christ as he hung on the cross. On it are written the words, Jesus of Nazareth, in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Some of the exact words recorded in the Bible.
The Gospel, according to St. John, tells us about the title of the cross, and I quote, "And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews."
No one questions such plaques were placed above the heads of those crucified. So if Christ died on the cross, he almost certainly would have had one too.
We know from Roman contemporary sources, Roman historians, but indeed, in most cases, the name of a person sentenced to death and the reason for this penalty were mentioned. And in the case of Christ, it was a very plausible inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, which was the name under which he was known. And the crime was to claim to be the King of the Jews.
For Hesseman, it's this inscription on the relic in Santa Croce that makes it so special. It's the only fragment of wood, he believes, with a credible link to the original cross of Christ.
When I saw it the very first time in the Basilica di Santa Croce in Rome, I was fascinated by the possibility that we do have an authentic, important relic going back towards the events in 30 AD, the sentence of Pontius Pilate, the crucifixion of Christ.
If he's right, it's a potential superstar among Christian relics.
If the title is authentic, we have the only surviving relic of the most important court case in history, the case of Jesus of Nazareth, and the potential to be the oldest written record mentioning the name of Jesus Christ.
15 years ago, Hessemann set out to prove its authenticity. Was there any evidence the fragment of wood he could see in Rome had come from the Holy Land? And if there was, how had it travelled 1,500 miles from the Middle East? The quest for answers would take Hessemann on a long and confusing journey. As Hessemann trawled back through the records, he found the first man to look for relics of the true cross was a Roman. In the 4th century AD, the Emperor Constantine had been struggling to unite the Roman Empire under his control.
The empire is vast. It reaches from Britain in the west, it takes in North Africa, it goes up into Middle Europe, it extends over into Turkey and so on. It's vast. It's also highly diverse. It's got peoples from different nations, different ethnic groups, different religions. And so there's always the possibility of revolution or insurrection.
What Constantine needed was a unifying belief system that would pull the empire together. He had found it in the new religion of Christianity.
It's pretty clear that he's seen in Christianity the possibility of a uniting force, something that can give the empire, across its full range, a common identity.
But to give the new religion popular appeal, Constantine needed symbols. One answer was relics, physical objects that could be traced back to Christ himself. For Hessemann, Constantine's search was an obvious place to start his quest. Was there any record that in his hunt for relics all those years ago, Constantine had found the true cross? The trail was nearly 2,000 years old. Hessemann's research led him to the work of a man in Sweden. Stephen Borghammar is Professor of Biblical Studies at the University of Lund in southern Sweden. He's drawn together memoirs and biographies from the time and produced an exhaustive account of Constantine's hunt for relics. They tell how the Roman Emperor's 70-year-old mother, Empress Helena, was sent to find the true cross.
By some accounts, Constantine sends Helena off to look for holy places, for relics of Christ's birth, passion, resurrection, ascension into heaven. By other accounts, it is Helena's own initiative.
Whichever version is true, in AD 325, Helena set off on a major expedition. Borghammar's work enabled Hessemann to trace the journey in some detail.
The journey started near Constantinople, present-day Istanbul. And if they had taken the land route, they would have gone basically from north to south in present-day Turkey, passing through the Taurus Mountains. And then they would have gone along the coast, basically down to Caesarea, and then by some route up to Jerusalem.
It was a journey of over 700 miles. It would have been tough going for somebody half Helena's age.
It's a long journey, a difficult journey, partly an uncertain journey. And of course, she's not exactly sure what she's going to find when she gets there. So I think we must assume that whatever else may be the case, she's a pretty impressive figure.
Helena's journey in pursuit of relics would be celebrated in paintings and murals. It took her several months. Helena finally arrived in Jerusalem. Here, one of the first places she looked for was the site of Christ's crucifixion.
She asks around. She asks the Christians. She asks some Jews. She asks some Romans. She asks whoever she can. What do we know about this? What's the narrative? Where was the Lord crucified?
She soon learned Christians were already venerating the symbol of Christ's crucifixion, the cross.
From early Christianity onwards, we find traces of the veneration of the cross. We find crosses inscribed on Christian ossuaries in Jerusalem. We found indications where the cross was a sacred symbol of Christianity from the very beginning.
But were there any physical remains of the original true cross? According to popular legend, Helena soon found a man who appeared to know where fragments were buried. But he wouldn't tell. So Helena, in the fashion of the day, ordered him tortured.
She puts him at the bottom of a well for a whole week without food, and then he softens and he says, "Okay, I'll show you the spot."
He took her to what was believed to be the site of the crucifixion. As Hesseman traced the story, he discovered Helena had found a Roman temple to Venus on top of the site.
Helena gives the instruction that the existing Roman temple is to be demolished and that excavations are to begin in search of the site of Christ's crucifixion. So she digs down and she finds a cistern, an area that was part of the water system but long ago dried up. And she finds the remains of 3 crosses.
Three crosses, identical to the account in the Bible which relates that Christ was crucified alongside 2 thieves. For Helena, it must have been a big moment, but also a puzzling one. How could she tell which was the wood of Christ's cross? Digging through records, Hesseman found the answer in an account written at the time. It came from a man known as Ambrose of Milan.
Ambrose of Milan was one of the most highly regarded bishops in the Christian world, in the Mediterranean world, in his lifetime.
Ambrose records that Helena had found among the pieces of wood a vital clue. She hadn't just found beams of wood. Attached to one cross was the titulus crucis, the piece of wood said to have hung above Christ's head.
The account in Ambrose is fairly detailed, telling the whole story of Helena finding the cross and mentioning also that the titulus was found together with it.
Hesseman then found a second corroborating account.
More or less at the same time as Ambrose, a church father called John Chrysostom, who was the bishop of Antioch, mentions this event. He says that the authenticity of the cross was proved because the titulus was still attached to it, it was sticking to it.
This is what Hesseman was looking for. Here was clear evidence that Helena had found the original true cross. And the proof was she'd also found the titulus crucis, the piece of wood Hesseman could see in the church in Rome.
As a historian working with the original sources, I have no doubt at all that the finding of the true cross under St. Helena in Jerusalem in 325 AD was a historical fact. Indeed, the titulus helped her to be sure that these pieces of wood found were indeed remains and relics of the crucifixion of Christ and not just of any other crucifixion.
But is any of this story really true? Had Helena even been to Jerusalem? One piece of proof was a very solid celebration of her achievement. To mark the site of her success in finding the true cross, she built a church. It's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Today, it's one of Jerusalem's most visited and important holy places. Hesseman had traced the first link in his hunt to prove the authenticity of the titulus crucis. He'd found strong evidence for its discovery. The next task was to find the link between Helena's discovery and the fragment of wood in Rome, over 1,000 miles away. Hesseman worked his way through the various accounts. He discovered that soon after finding the cross, Helena had divided the relics.
The early church historians mention that the findings were divided, that she sent a part of the wood of the true cross, a part of the nails, she found 3 nails, to her son in Constantinople. A part remained in Jerusalem, and the third part was taken to Rome.
One of the best witnesses to this distribution of relics was Cyril, the 4th century bishop of Jerusalem.
Cyril of Jerusalem mentioned in a letter that the true cross was divided in so many parts that it filled the earth, the face of the earth.
Hesseman found 4th and 5th century records of the true cross reaching Gaul, North Africa, Asia Minor, and Syria. And he also found something that would prove critical to his quest. Helena had not just divided up the wood of the cross. She'd also cut up the titulus crucis itself, simply chopped it into several pieces. Exactly how many bits remains uncertain. But there's a good account of what became of at least one piece in Jerusalem. Some 60 years after Helena's triumph, it was seen by a Spanish pilgrim. She was called Egeria.
She tells how on one particular day there was a celebratory event in which a box was produced. The Bishop of Jerusalem, assisted by some presbyters, or we might now think of kind of priest figures, attended this. The box was open, and revealed within it were parts of the cross and the titulus itself.
Egeria says she has seen it, and she is, generally speaking, a good witness to things and persons and events. She seems to be very reliable.
Here was further proof the true cross had been found and had survived. But Hesseman also found something else. Helena had kept one piece of the relic for herself. Hesseman now made another crucial link in the story. In Rome, he found accounts that suggested Helena had brought some of the relics home with her.
When St. Helena returned to Rome, she brought 3 relics, a large fragment of the two crosses, half of the titulus crucis, and one of the nails found.
It seems Helena never intended these relics for public display. They were destined for her private palace. In the second half of the 4th century AD, Helena died. Her sarcophagus is in St. Peter's in Rome. It's decorated with highlights from her life. She was canonized and is often depicted with a cross. Hesseman had completed the next link in his quest. He had traced the titulus from Jerusalem to Rome. But at this point, the trail gets murky. What had become of the relic after Helena's death? Hesseman now needed to find new sources of evidence. He turned to church records in Rome. Here he found that Helena had donated her relics, including the titulus crucis, to the Pope, Sylvester I.
When St. Helena died, she passed on in her testament her palace with everything which was in it, including her private chapel and the relics.
Several years after her death, the Pope built a new church on top of her palace. He called it the Church of Santa Croce, or the Holy Cross.
If you go to Rome, you can still see the walls of the Roman palace incorporated into the basilica.
But as Hesseman searched further, the records were tantalizingly vague. There seemed to be no mention of the relics themselves. Then the story became even more confused. Reading through church records, Hesseman found that 800 years after Helena's death, in the 12th century, the Church of Santa Croce had undergone extensive restoration. But again, the records made no mention of the relics, or even if they still existed. The trail seemed to have gone completely cold. But then, there was a breakthrough. Checking church archives, Hesseman came across an account dating from 1492 of repair work on the ceiling of Santa Croce.
In the part which originally was the chapel, the private chapel of Sancta Helena, they removed the mosaics which were falling down and found a brick with an inscription, Titulus Crucis. Of course, they removed this brick, and behind they found a box. They removed it, they found a seal of a cardinal from the 12th century, from 1144. And they broke the seal. They opened it and they found the piece of wood with the inscription in 3 languages, Jesus of Nazareth. The fragment of the Titulus Crucis, the fragment of the inscription of the cross.
It was an extraordinary discovery. The first confirmed sighting of the Titulus Crucis for over 1,000 years. Hessemann now put together what must have happened. When the church had been restored in the 12th century, the relics must have been packed away in the roof, where they'd remained until their discovery in 1492. Hessemann was back on the trail of the Titulus. Or was he? The discovery raised another question. If it was genuine, why would one of the most important Christian relics of all time remain hidden in the roof of a chapel? Hessemann puzzled over what might have happened at Santa Croce. Finally, he came up with an answer.
In the early Middle Ages and late Antiquity, it was normal not to expose relics for public veneration, but to hide them in the walls of a church, because they believe that it sanctifies the entire church.
In Hessemann's judgment, the very fact that the Titulus Crucis had remained hidden away lent it even greater authenticity.
Who is creating a complicated fake to hide it in a wall? Not to expose it, not to show it, not to tell people, look what we have, to attract pilgrims during the holy years in Rome. Not to collect donations from the pilgrims, not to expose it for public veneration, but to hide it in a wall. This doesn't make sense at all to me.
Whatever the truth, Hessemann found that in 1492, the church authorities put the Titulus Crucis on public display, where it's remained ever since. Hessemann had successfully linked the Titulus Crucis in Rome back to the Holy Land. Yet some links in the story were still uncertain. In particular, the link between the Titulus arriving in Rome and its discovery by workmen in the 15th century was weak. What he needed was definitive evidence that would link the relic in Rome with Helena's discovery of it, 1,200 years earlier. Hessemann now embarked on a close scrutiny of the fragment of the Titulus itself.
The Titulus Crucis is a piece of brown nutwood, 25 by 14 centimeters in size, 700 grams in weight. And it is obviously the right-hand corner of something bigger, because we have a high degree of decay on the top on the right and the lower side, but a very clear cut on the left.
That cut was crucial. It matched exactly the account of Helena cutting up the Titulus Crucis. Hessemann then looked at the text. It was written, like Hebrew, from right to left. This suggested it might well have been inscribed by a native of Jerusalem.
It has 3 lines of inscription in Hebrew, in Greek, and in Latin, all giving the same information, Yeshu HaNozri, I.Nazarenus, I.Nazarenus, the name of Jesus of Nazareth.
The colouring was also typical of the Roman era in Palestine.
The letters have remains of black color inside, and the brown wood was covered with the remains of white chalk. So obviously it was originally black and white. And this is typical for Roman wood tablets in general. They make the colorization so it's better readable.
But it was the words on the titulus crucis that particularly attracted Hesemon's attention. There are 2 biblical accounts of the words on the titulus. The first comes from the Gospel of Luke. He says the order was Greek on top, then Latin, then Hebrew. The second account comes from the Gospel of John. He reports the order as Hebrew first, then Latin, then Greek. But the order on the actual titulus is different from both. It goes Hebrew, then Greek, then Latin. This was the first puzzle. More puzzling still, there were variations in the spelling of the word Nazareth.
In all Latin translations of the Gospel according to John, it is written Nazarenus, but here on the titulus it is written Nazarenus, with an I instead of an E.
For Hesemon, these errors were highly significant.
No forger would ever make spelling mistakes in a forgery.
They led him to conclude they were vital clues that proved the authenticity of the titulus crucis.
There are too many freedoms, there are too many differences from the information we have in the Gospel. No forger would take the freedom to change the spelling, to change the order, even to write from right to left. This all indicates that it was a spontaneous creation and not an elaborated fake. And that's why I believe it was indeed the original inscription of the cross of Jesus of Nazareth.
In other words, for Hesemon, the very fact that the writing on the titulus was different from the version in the Gospels proved it was authentic. A forger would never make such basic mistakes. But that left one final question. Could an inscribed piece of wood really have survived nearly 2,000 years? The answer came, unexpectedly, from Roman remains in Britain, Hadrian's Wall. In 1973, archaeologists digging at the Roman fort of Vindolanda found nearly 2,000 handwritten tablets made of slivers of wood. They dated from the time of Christ. They had been beautifully preserved in waterlogged soil where there was almost no oxygen present. Oxygen encourages decay. The conditions were almost identical to those in which the titulus crucis is thought to have been found.
You can ask if a piece of wood can survive 2,000 years, and the answer is of course. Especially if the tradition is true, that the remains, that the 3 crosses were found in an old cistern.
Hesemon now had at least 5 clues that in his judgment pointed to the titulus being authentic. First, the evidence from Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, appeared to confirm Helena had dug up the titulus crucis in Jerusalem. Second, the record from Cyril of Jerusalem suggested she divided the relics and distributed them across the world. Third, the fact that it had been hidden during the Middle Ages suggested it was the real thing. Why hide a fake? 4. Variations between the wording on the actual titulus and the accounts in the Gospels again pointed to its authenticity. No forger would risk such blatant errors. And now, finally, evidence from Hadrian's Wall suggested a wooden tablet with writing on it could, under the right conditions, survive 2,000 years. For Hesemann, the evidence was now overwhelming. The titulus in Rome was authentic. He had found a relic of the true cross. Hesemann took his findings to the highest authority.
I found it a relevant discovery for the Christian faith, and that's why I presented it to Pope John Paul II.
History doesn't relate what the Pope's response was, but a number of senior Christians are prepared to give Hesemann's titulus crucis at least the benefit of the doubt.
If we ask ourselves the question, what relics might have survived from the crucifixion, it's in fact highly likely that among those would have been this title that was put upon the cross. It's so important as identifying the figure of Jesus that it's very likely that it would have been preserved, and of course it was very easy to remove and take away. So the idea that all of this is necessarily ridiculous and medieval superstition and so on is something we should just suspend judgment on.
But are they right? So far, all Hesemann's evidence had either been a paper trail or had relied on basic archaeological techniques. Could hard scientific scrutiny now back this up? The investigation was about to take a new twist. In 2002, a laboratory at the University of Rome conducted radiocarbon dating tests on the titulus crucis. If it was authentic, it should date from around 30 AD.
They took 6 samples from the back of the titulus crucis. You do a level of pre-treatment that should get rid of any contaminant carbon from the sample.
After this decontamination, the tiny pieces of wood were analysed for their radiocarbon-14 content to discover their age.
They also analysed other samples of known age as confirmation that the accuracy and precision was fine. And they came up with a consensus value that was significantly different from what you would have expected.
The conclusion was unequivocal.
When the radiocarbon age was calibrated, it gave a calendar age range of 890 to 1150 AD, and that's with 95.4% probability.
In short, the relic in Rome dated from the Middle Ages, 900 years after the death of Christ. It could not be part of the true cross. But for some, this is not the end of the matter. They argue carbon dating has been wrong before. One of the most famous controversies was in the 1980s. In 1988, samples of the Turin shroud were tested for their age. The shroud is a piece of fabric bearing an apparently 3D image of a Christ-like human face. Legend says the cloth was placed over the face of Jesus after his crucifixion and miraculously picked up his image. When samples of the shroud were sent to 3 different laboratories for radiocarbon dating, the results suggested it was a medieval fake.
The results were comparable between the 3 laboratories and gave an age range of 1260 to 1390 AD with a 95.4% probability that the true age lies within that span. Now that's not to say that the other 5% is way out of that span.
Yet a number of people, few of them scientists, have challenged the finding. They believe there were fundamental problems with the sample. It was contaminated.
The shroud has a vast history. People have gotten their fingers all over it. Artists have copied it. There's been paint dropped on it. It's been in countless numbers of chapels and so on, with all that atmosphere there. It's been through a fire, at least one we know of, and doused with water. The fire was so hot that it melted the metal casket that the shroud was in. So all of these are tremendous contaminants.
They argue that problems like these have discredited carbon-14 testing, certainly in the case of the shroud.
Carbon-14 is certainly valid and a good procedure along with other procedures, but it certainly also can be wrong, as in this case, in my opinion. It was botched.
Most scientists dispute this challenge. But similar arguments about contamination are now raging around the titulus crucis. For Hessemann, the carbon dating results are simply not credible.
When I learned about the result of the carbon dating, claiming to be a forgery from the Middle Ages, it was clear for me that it has to be wrong. We know that carbon dating is only reliable in 75% of the cases, but there's a 25% margin of factors which cannot be controlled, factors of contamination and conditions we do not know.
In particular, Hessemann believes there will have been carbon contamination from candles and human breath. These more recent carbon deposits would, he argues, have built up, impregnating the ancient wood. That in turn could have led to a false reading in the carbon dating tests. But Gordon Cook, a recognized expert in carbon dating, profoundly disagrees.
The idea that 25% of all radiocarbon tests are wrong is quite preposterous. You could argue that the smoke from the candles could have embedded itself in the wood, but when the pre-treatment that was undertaken should have removed virtually all of that.
Yet Hessemann has now dismissed all carbon dating tests of the titulus crucis. He believes he's found a much more reliable alternative form of dating. It's a method that draws on changing styles of handwriting. It's called comparative paleography.
This method is accepted in history because people changed the way of writing during the ages. If you have a letter written by your granny during World War II, the handwriting is different from the handwriting of people today.
Comparative paleography argues that the writing style of one period is not only different from another, but during any one period there is a clear uniformity of style. So a medieval text will always look different from a piece of copperplate writing, which in turn could never be mistaken for a 19th century piece of writing. Hessemann sent photographs of the text on the titulus crucis to a number of experts.
I presented copies of the Titulus Crucis to 7 experts on comparative pyrography of 3 different universities in Israel.
The experts examined the Greek, Hebrew, and Latin texts. They all, apparently, came to the same conclusion.
All of them, experts on Latin, Greek, and Hebrew pyrography in the Holy Land, scholars who worked with the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated it into the 1st century, the time of Christ.
But is comparative paleography really more reliable than carbon dating? For over 60 years, scientists have used carbon-14 tests to date ancient artifacts, from Egyptian pyramids to medieval church relics. It has consistently proved reliable.
Radiocarbon dating has a scientific basis. We can calculate an age on an object. If you take paleographic techniques, it would be possible to forge an earlier writing style on a piece of wood to make it look like the Titulus Crucis.
Yet Michael Hesseman is unmoved.
We have not a single case where comparative pyrography is wrong, where people in the Middle Ages prove that they were able to write like people wrote 1,000 years before. If I, as a historian, have the choice between 2 methods, comparative pyrography and carbon dating, I trust comparative pyrography.
There, for now, the matter rests. To most scientists, the evidence from carbon dating makes it highly unlikely that Titulus Crucis is part of the true cross. But that won't stop some people believing in it. To many Christians, the idea that Christ's cross has survived is just too powerful an idea. In 1938, Adolf Hitler seized what legend said was history's most powerful weapon.
If you hold it, you're invincible.
It was said to be the spear which pierced the side of Christ.
Military leaders became almost besotted with the idea of possessing it.
And with the spear in his grasp, Hitler unleashed terror upon the world. But in the chaos of war, this most valuable of Europe's treasures simply vanished.
This was an emblem of war, twisted by the Nazis to become symbols of the Third Reich.
But one man, Walter Horn, would uncover the mystery of what had happened to the Spear of Destiny. And one of America's finest generals, obsessed with the spear, would launch a mission to find it. In 1933, Adolf Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany.
Hitler was by no means a normal person to be leading a country in the middle of Europe in the middle of the 20th century, and especially one the size of Germany. He was a very embittered, lonely, twisted, abnormal individual who had an enormous amount of drive and this famous will to power. And that's what really, spurred him on.
He is desperate to be the all-powerful leader of the German people. and create a new Germanic empire. The trouble is, he had won less than half of the popular vote.
His grip on power was nothing like as strong as many people think. I mean, after all, most people hadn't voted for Hitler.
The country is divided, and to realize his dreams, he will need to unite it.
Germany was, until just a few years before, in real terms, just a collection of very, very small states. You know, you've got people in, all the way up near the Danish border, and you've got people all the way down near Munich, and as far east into what would now be part of Poland. So how do you unify these people?
Hitler encourages the Germans to look to what he says is their past. He wants to portray himself as a man who will restore Germany to a time when it ruled Europe. And he wants to extend its borders to those of the greatest German empire in history, the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was first created by Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the Germanic king of the Franks in 800 AD. Its purpose? To spread Christianity through all of Europe. For 1,000 years it dominated the continent. At its height, stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and ruling over what is now Germany and much of Austria, Poland, Italy and France. Now Hitler wanted to create an even greater empire in his own image. The 1,000-year Nazi Reich with himself at its head.
He wasn't the type of person who would like to cut deals and engage in the art of statesmanship or diplomacy. This is a man who just wanted to drive things forward the way he saw the world should be in his eyes.
But Hitler's difficulty is that there is nothing imperial about him. As the son of a working-class Austrian civil servant, it is not enough to simply proclaim himself the German Führer. He needs to look like one.
He needed to try and assimilate some of the trappings of power and the type of trappings that would be suitable for someone who is ruling a kingdom in the middle of Europe. And of course, what's he going to do? He's going to look back to history to find these things.
He decided that to be an emperor, he would need the possessions of an emperor.
Hitler was looking for an emblem that would underpin his claim to be leading the German people back to a new era.
What do we need? Well, we need various items that are associated with other people in power.
The Holy Roman emperors had held crown jewels as symbols of their authority. An imperial crown, a scepter, and an orb. But of all these symbols of past German glory, one is more important than all the others. It looks like a simple Roman spearhead. It is the Spear of Destiny. The Spear of Destiny was said to be none other than the spear that had pierced the side of Jesus Christ as he hung on the cross. The myth said that it was wielded by a Roman centurion called Longinus.
As the legend is told, Longinus was a Roman centurion who'd served Pilate faithfully, and he got cataracts. He was going blind. And Pilate pulled him out of the ranks because he was no longer of service as a fighter and gave him relative easy duty at Mount Calvary, making sure the crucifixions went off as planned. It didn't require a lot of fighting, didn't require great eyesight.
The Bible says that this centurion, when inspecting the crucified men, was unsure if Jesus had died. So he thrust his spear into Christ's side.
Blood allegedly dripped down the side of the spear into Longinus's eyes. He was cured of cataracts. He was cured of his blindness. He had a vision of the future. He had a vision of Jesus as the Messiah.
Longinus was converted instantly. As Christianity spreads throughout the world, Longinus's spear, touched by the Son of God, became a revered holy relic. The spear was passed down, first through a succession of Roman emperors, and then to Charlemagne.
Charlemagne carries it into battle, is invincible as long as it's in his hands.
It becomes known as a talisman for conquerors, for military force. It is a military image that it has of vanquishing foes.
Such was its mystique that every Holy Roman Emperor after Charlemagne wanted to possess it. It became a symbol of their authority.
The spear, at a very early point in history, is a reflection of power, of strength.
Legend says that whoever held the spear would be undefeated in battle.
So not only do you get a sense of whoever has this is the true world monarch because he has it, but if you hold it, you're invincible.
It was clear why Hitler wanted it, but he didn't have it. In fact, it was in Vienna, the capital of neighboring Austria. When the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved in 1806, its heirs, the Habsburgs, moved the spear to Austria, where it ended up on display in the Hofburg Palace. And it was here in 1908 that Adolf Hitler, then a struggling Austrian painter, had first seen the spear and begun to covet it.
According to one version of the story, Hitler had actually seen the spear in the museum there, and apparently he may have had some sort of moment of epiphany in which he realised that this was an incredibly important object and he had been sort of touched by it. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. The point was, it was regarded as being important.
Hitler had long known where it was. And now he was German Führer. All he had to do was take it. On March the 12th, 1938, German troops crossed the border into Austria. The world watched as the Austrian government collapsed. Hitler was killing two birds with one stone. He was reclaiming lands once held by the Roman Empire, and was now on the brink of seizing the Spear of Destiny.
You've got to realise that Austria and Germany are, in Hitler's eyes, indivisible, and indeed they should never have been divided in the first place.
With Austria in his grasp, Hitler now activated the second part of his plan. To seize the spear.
As the story is told, as the panzers were driving, across the border into Austria, Hitler had an SS officer in civilian garb already planted in the museum. When he was alerted that the border had been crossed, he changed into his uniform, pulled out his gun, and stood guard over those crown jewels. Nobody was to touch them until Hitler arrived.
Hitler arrived in Vienna just 2 days after the invasion.
One of the very first things he does is to go to the Habsburg Museum, go to the display case where the spear and the crown jewels are, and opens it. And takes possession of the spear.
He took hold of the spear on March the 15th. It was not a date picked by accident.
He took the Spear of Destiny on St. Longinus Day. That's when the centurion, who allegedly carried it at the crucifixion, is honored.
Hitler took the spear to the southern German city of Nuremberg, which had been its home for centuries during the reign of the Holy Roman Emperors.
There was absolutely no question where Hitler was going to take the spear once he absconded with it from Austria. He was going to take it back to Nuremberg, back to its spiritual home, what was to be the spiritual headquarters, the spiritual capital of Nazism, of the 1,000-year Reich.
Taking his lead from the Holy Roman Empire, Hitler had decided to place Nuremberg at the center of his new Nazi Reich.
Berlin is the brain, Nuremberg is the heart.
Here he had built vast parade grounds holding hundreds of thousands of spectators. He staged enormous rallies showcasing German military might. Extravagant displays presented the German people with an image of the future based on his vision of the past.
We see newsreels today of the parades going through the streets in Nuremberg, of soldiers dressed as medieval knights. With mock-ups of the chest of the crown jewels, symbolic of being returned to the homeland. The 1,000-year Reich begins.
By displaying the spear and the crown jewels, his message could not have been any clearer.
Ein freies deutsches Volk in einem starken deutschen Reich.
He was the heir to the Holy Roman Emperors.
It was as if King Arthur had finally gotten Excalibur and was marching through town with it. And in a triumphal parade, I got it.
With the Spear of Destiny in his possession, Hitler was convinced he would be unstoppable in his aim to conquer the rest of Europe. But of course, it didn't turn out that way. By the beginning of 1945, 5 years of war has devastated Europe. The spear has failed to bring Hitler the victory he had dreamed of. His ambitions lie in tatters. His empire on the brink of collapse. And in the chaos, the Spear of Destiny, one of the great treasures of Europe, has disappeared. But on an American army base in Belgium, pure luck will allow one man to track it down. Walter Horn is a lieutenant in the US Third Army. His mission? To interrogate German prisoners of war. Horn is no ordinary American GI. For one thing, he's German. And 10 years earlier, he had narrowly escaped the clutches of the SS. In the 1930s, Horn was at university in Heidelberg, southwest Germany. His passion, art history.
His specialty was the relics of the Holy Roman Empire. He was an art history major who just had the misfortune to get his doctoral degree in 1933, just as Adolf Hitler had come to power.
As a historian, Horn found himself being sucked into Hitler's obsession with proving the superiority of the German race. He was invited to join a special unit of the SS created specifically for this purpose, the Ahnenerbe. Promising academics were press-ganged into the Ahnenerbe. The job? To prove at any cost that German culture was superior to every culture in the world. And who better for the Ahnenerbe to recruit than the impressive young academic and PhD, Walter Horn.
Walter was perfect Nazi material. He had been a javelin contender for the Olympics. He came from fifth generation Germanic, Aryan stock. You know, he was young, he was good looking, he was well traveled. This was the kind of man the Nazis were looking for.
But Horn could see exactly where Nazi control of German academic life was leading.
The Ahnenerbe can't just be seen as a kind of harmless bunch of corrupted academics who were just sucking up to the Nazis, because what they were proving was helping to create a worldview that was in essence evil. And some of these theories are directly related to the idea of race. And we all know what happens when you apply these theories to a regime that is as murderous as the Nazis are. It leads directly to the gates of Auschwitz.
Horn wanted no part of it. So in 1934, he decided to flee Germany.
He didn't want to give up his homeland, but he saw no option around it. One thing he knew is he had to get out of Germany. You know, the storm is coming down. This is no place to be.
But as he began his flight to freedom, Horn learned that the SS were after him.
He was very concerned. He hated the Nazis. He didn't know if it was because of remarks that he had made about the Nazis.
To his horror, one SS officer had managed to track him down.
The SS officer had his pistol, and I'm sure Walter was thinking that the end had come.
But Horn was in for yet another surprise.
The SS officer essentially, told him, yes, we're looking for people like you, but good luck. Just don't come back.
Walter Horn eventually managed to escape via Italy and then Cuba to America, where he became a naturalized American citizen. And that is how, as a fluent German speaker, he ended up in Belgium interrogating POWs at the tail end of the war.
As the Allied armies worked their way into Germany, behind the front lines, you've got units doing various sort of ancillary roles that are nevertheless vitally important. One of these, of course, is to hunt for criminals. Straight manhunts. And what these people are doing, these war crimes units, is to hunt for evidence, which hasn't been burnt by the Gestapo.
For months, Horn had been uncovering very little, but one afternoon, a harmless-looking POW changed all that.
Quite late in the day, relative old man is taken out of the prisoner pen to be interrogated. Private Fritz Huber. Fritz Huber has nothing really to contribute, or so it seems. Private Huber said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you any information because I don't know any information. All I've been doing is, slogging gun cases around. Walter felt sorry for him, offered him a cigarette, offered him a cup of coffee, and they just sat and chatted.
Then, Huber revealed something that would blow Walter Horn's mind.
Huber said, I do know of a special treasure, a hidden treasure. Are you at all interested in art history? Little could Huber have known the man he was talking to had a doctorate in art history. There wasn't anything in the world Walter wanted to hear more about, than art and antiques.
Huber began to tell Horn about a Nazi treasure trove hidden beneath Nuremberg Castle, one which supposedly contained any number of priceless pieces of art. Horn listened intently as Huber listed the sort of items that any imaginary pirate hoard might contain.
Huber was describing various treasures, which could have been any kind of depositories, because we know the Nazis looted, major museums. But this collection was different. He described a scepter. He described a crown. He described a golden orb, what they call, the world orb of Christianity. And then he said, it's a spear. It's a spearhead, Roman spearhead. And of course, Walter knew instantly the collection. There was no question what it was. He was describing, the crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire. And the spear of destiny.
Horn pushed Huber for every detail and was amazed to find out the lengths that the Nazis had gone to protect the Spear of Destiny. Huber said his father had been hired by the head of the Nazi SS, Heinrich Himmler, to install a ventilation system in a hidden vault beneath Nuremberg Castle.
And, oh, by the way, my mother goes in once a week to check on the treasures that are kept in this vault. She has to check the humidity, check against insects. My mother's got to wear white gloves. And as Huber is telling this story, Walter's getting more and more interested.
Huber described a network of tunnels beneath the castle which led out to a secret entrance on the streets below.
It looked like an active, ongoing antique shop and had two doors for bringing items in and out, but of course it was Nazis who were going the in and out.
Aware that he had possibly just uncovered the location of one of the world's great treasures, Horn immediately began to write up a report for his superiors. But fearing the American High Command wouldn't understand the importance of the spear, Horn made sure to write in detail, even drawing a map of the city to show where the vault could be found.
Walter Horn sat at a borrowed typewriter, and he typed up an intelligence report. And of course, being an art historian, I'm sure it reads more like a art history paper than a military intelligence report.
Horn worked quickly. He knew the advancing Allied forces were planning a huge offensive on Nuremberg. And he feared that in the battle, the spear could be destroyed.
He mailed it off, fully thinking that this would be dismissed as tangential to the fighting going on, that what military commander would possibly conceive the Holy Roman Empire, crown jewels, and the Spear of Destiny to be a military objective.
But in another amazing stroke of luck, Horn's report eventually landed on the desk of the one man who had both the power and the will to save the spear. General George S. Patton, also known as Old Blood and Guts, was in command of the US Third Army in Europe and was one of the generals overseeing the invasion of Germany. A flamboyant man, often pictured with 2 silver revolvers, he was a brilliant tank commander and tactician. A Catholic convert, Patton saw himself as a Christian warrior. But more than that, he too was obsessed with the legend of the Spear of Destiny. He had even written a poem about what it must have felt like to plunge the spear into the side of Christ.
I cannot name my battles, for the visions are not clear. Yet I see the twisted faces, and I feel the rending spear. Perhaps I stabbed our Savior in his sacred helpless side. Yet I've called his name in blessing when after times I died.
As US troops battled their way across Europe, Patton had been attempting to track the spear's movements. His fear was that the spear, if not found, might be used as a talisman to inspire a Nazi resurgence. But so far, he had no idea where the spear was, until Walter Horn's report landed on his desk.
Lo and behold, that's exactly what Patton was looking for, and he found it in that intelligence report. Light bulb went off. This was a military objective for Patton.
On the eve of the assault on Nuremberg, Patton took an amazing decision. He ensured that a crack team of soldiers was sent to locate the secret vault. But it would be no easy task. Nuremberg had suffered a series of massive bombing raids. Thousands had died, hundreds of thousands displaced.
They talk about the devastation in Dresden, but the devastation in Dresden essentially came from a fire that spread. In Nuremberg, it was literally from the tons and tons of bombs.
And now the Allies intended to send Hitler a message. They planned to capture Nuremberg on April the 20th, the Führer's birthday. Hitler was adamant that his spiritual capital would not fall.
His instructions are that the defenders of Nuremberg will fight to the last bullet, and the last man, and even the last young child.
On April the 16th, the US Army began a fight to the death for the city. Patton's special unit, sent to locate the spear, was soon caught in the thick of the fighting.
It was narrow, medieval streets, big battlements. It was almost essentially hand-to-hand combat, almost like taking one street after another, and it was very dangerous kind of fighting. Children were actually being used as scouts. The Germans fought right down virtually, to the last man standing.
In the chaos of the battle, Patton's unit, armed with Horn's man, embarked on their dangerous mission to locate the secret vault.
That unit lost many men to work their way where the vault was. When they got there, they couldn't even find it. There had been such devastation, so many bombings, and they weren't even sure that they'd gotten to the location.
But then they made a discovery.
One of them found a crevice, a sort of tunnel-like thing, and they dropped in.
At the end of a long, dark underground tunnel, they found something staggering. Set into thick concrete, a steel vault door 8 feet high and 12 inches thick. But there was a problem. The giant vault doors were locked shut.
The door itself was impenetrable at that point. When one of the munitions men was literally about to, plug dynamite in the sides of this giant vault door.
But just moments before the charges were detonated, a German civilian came forward and stopped the munitions man.
Luckily, he was stopped at the last minute because, God knows what might have happened to the contents inside. A German a representative, the mayor of Nuremberg, gave the Allies the combination of this vault. He said, please don't blow this up. Very special things here, and they opened the vault.
Behind the giant door, the GIs discovered a vast and incredibly sophisticated underground complex. This had to be the vault that the prisoner Huber had described, but it was on a scale beyond anything they had imagined. Commissioned by Heinrich Himmler, it was an enormous expansion of old beer cellars beneath the Nuremberg castle.
Himmler secretly sent in teams of architects, teams of builders to reconfigure this beer cellar into a high-tech vault. And I don't use that term high-tech loosely. Foot-thick reinforced steel, special locking mechanisms. The walls were lined with various materials to keep the moisture out. Air purification system, its own generator system. It had water, it had showers, it had baths, it had a kitchen, it had its own little escape hatch. You could have a team of people living in there for months at a time.
The GIs could hardly believe what they had found. But unsure of exactly what they had discovered, the message was sent for Horn to come to Nuremberg to identify the contents of the vault. When Horn arrived, he was shocked by the state of this once beautiful medieval city.
Picture a moonscape. Picture, churches missing their roofs, bodies strewn about.
Horn was led to the vault. Even though the contents had been described to him by Huber, Horn was stunned by what the vaults contained.
There is just this fantastic room full of Europe's treasure, which can rival anything you'll see in the Louvre or the British Museum. And it really is a real treasure trove. And the guys who went in there realised, my God, I mean, how much had the Nazis taken? Every box was just full of something more and more incredible.
Horn was shown a small wooden crate. In it, unmistakable to Horn's expert eyes, was the Spear of Destiny.
Horn became a hero when he recovered the Spear of Destiny. Now the question was, what were they to do with him?
May 1945, the Allies declare victory over Hitler's Nazi regime. 6 years of war draws to a close. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. The Allies uncovered millions of dollars worth of Europe's finest treasures, stolen by the Nazis.
We know the Nazis looted, major museums. Major collections were brought wholesale in by train.
Now began the task of returning these treasures to their rightful owners. Walter Horn had assumed the spear would be returned to Austria.
The Spear of Destiny come from the Hofburg Museum in Vienna. This is where he fully thought they would be returned to. Patton had other ideas.
It seemed that Patton, too, had become bewitched by the power of the Spear of Destiny.
Patton said and openly declared that these relics, this Spear of Destiny, are not artwork. These are emblems of war, twisted by the Nazis to become symbols of the Third Reich.
Patton was the type of man who very much would have liked the idea of the Spear of Destiny, in his back pocket and wanted to take it back to the United States.
Perhaps he believed, as did Hitler, that, whoever possessed the spear would be invincible.
So adamant was Patton on having the spear that Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of all Allied troops in Europe, had to intervene. A huge argument broke out between these two iconic figures. But before it could be resolved, tragedy struck.
His car is hit by a lorry. He's virtually paralyzed. He's in hospital for a short period and then he dies.
With Patton died the last obstacle to the spear returning home to Vienna.
Special plane was dispatched under a very heavy armed guard because these are considered the most valuable treasures that the Nazis had ever looted. And there was a special return ceremony in Austria. And today, they're back in the museum, essentially, in the same room, in the same part of the museum where they were when Hitler took them.
But there remains one outstanding question. What was this item that Walter Horn had recovered and that so many people had fought and died for? Could it really be the spear that Charlemagne held, the very spear that pierced Christ's side? Robert Feather, a trained metallurgist, was the first person in 40 years to be allowed to examine the spear scientifically.
I was called in to examine the spear because I'd had previous experience of metallurgical work on ancient artifacts. I trained as a metallurgist and I've sort of done a lot of work in ancient metals and materials.
One of the first tests he did was to see if there were traces of blood on the spear. If it were Christ's blood, it would be the most staggering discovery of all time.
I took swabs of the spear just in case there was any biological material. I mean, if it's a spear, it could have had some blood on it somewhere, and the remotest chance that some of it might be Jesus' blood just occurred. So I thought I'd better do it just in case. Is someone going to say, why didn't you?
But no traces of blood could be found. Next, he did a series of non-destructive tests to uncover the age of the spear.
We did XRF, which is X-ray fluorescent tests. We did microscopic analysis. We did full high-powered X-ray analysis.
These tests finally gave an approximate date to the spear itself. The 7th or 8th century AD.
To say that it was the spear that went into the side of Jesus, I think, is rather difficult, if not virtually impossible.
It's impossible really to have had much contact with someone who had supposedly died 8 centuries before it was made.
Science had proven that the Vienna lance was not the spear that had pierced the side of Christ. So does this mean it is worthless? Had thousands of lives been risked in pursuit of nothing more than a medieval forgery? After all, one uncomfortable fact, even for Hitler, was that it wasn't the only spear claiming to be the spear of destiny.
The problem with the spear is that there are quite a few of them. I mean, I think there are at least 4.
There are competitor spears in different places to the Vienna spear. There's one in Etchmiad in Armenia. It doesn't look very much like a spear, and it's more rather like a Roman bannerhead, but nevertheless they revere it. And there's another one in Poland, which is almost certainly a replica, a later middle-aged reproduction. There's another one in St. Peter's, in the Basilica of St. Peter's, which is said to be part of the spear that pierced the side of Jesus.
But it seems that the spear Hitler coveted had a value that none of the others had.
We know more about the early history of the Vienna spear than any of the others, and we can trace it certainly in written record back to the 8th century.
That date is extremely significant. It was when Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, was rising to power. This spear may not have been the spear which pierced Christ's side, but it was the spear held by the Holy Roman Emperors.
There's no question that that spear was the one carried by the Holy Roman Emperors, and that this was the one passed on, throughout history, through tradition, and was the one that Hitler took.
And Hitler had understood something else. It doesn't matter what something is. What matters is what people believe it to be. For centuries, the spear had been revered by the most powerful rulers of Europe, and that, for Hitler, was enough to make it something worth having.
It doesn't really matter whether this was the spear that was shoved into the side of Jesus. It doesn't matter. It's what people think is what matters. It's what people choose to believe.
The fact that it doesn't date back to the crucifixion doesn't make it, to my mind, any less valuable, because what it represents in the larger sense is what's important.
Even though it's very easy today to look at it as all being part of, it's all mumbo jumbo, it's kind of, junk history, it's kind of mythology, it's superstition, it's important.
From the Knights of the Round Table to the Nazis, the Holy Grail is the world's most sought-after Christian relic.
It symbolizes redemption, it symbolizes salvation, it symbolizes eternal life.
This was the cup said to have been used by Jesus at the Last Supper.
Objects that had come in contact with the body of Christ were particularly important.
Credited with supernatural powers, it has been sought by knights and treasure hunters for centuries.
It's this incredible holy object that you search for on a great quest.
But were they all looking in the wrong places? Because one person thinks she has found it. Janice Bennett believes an agate cup in the Cathedral of Valencia is the Holy Grail. What's more, it has been on display there for more than 500 years.
It's an important relic, it's an important symbol of Christianity, and it deserves attention and veneration.
This is the story of her quest to uncover the truth.
It really had all the makings of being one of the greatest stories in the history of humanity.
If she is right, this is an amazing tale of courage and survival that could finally lay to rest the mystery of the Holy Grail. In 1991, whilst on holiday in Spain, American writer and historian Janice Bennett visited the ancient city of Valencia. After walking around the old quarter, she decided to visit the magnificent cathedral. It was here, quite by accident, that she stumbled on something bizarre and intriguing.
I happened to notice a small chapel in the cathedral as I was leaving.
Entering the chapel, she saw an illuminated shrine behind the high altar containing a small chalice. Richly studded with pearls, rubies, and emeralds, this is Valencia Cathedral's most prized possession, the Santo Cáliz, also known in English as the Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail was a drinking vessel which was venerated. And the legends say why it was venerated. It was venerated as the cup of Christ from the Last Supper.
According to Christian belief, the Last Supper was the final meal Jesus shared with his apostles in Jerusalem before he was betrayed and crucified.
He took the bread and he said, "This is my body," and he broke the bread and shared it with his disciples. And then he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant." And once again, the disciples drank from the cup. And then he said, crucially, do this in memory of me. So this was not just a one-off meal, it was something that he wanted his followers to repeat.
One of the core beliefs of Christianity, the sacrament of the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, derives from the words spoken by Jesus at that meal. The act has become central to all Christian worship.
The Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. It's really at the heart of everything we do, everything we believe. We believe that Christ is present under the appearance of bread and wine. And when we receive the bread and wine at communion, we are receiving Jesus. We are one with him.
But on that day in Valencia, to Janice it seemed almost absurd. Surely she couldn't be standing just a few meters away from the Holy Grail.
I really didn't feel anything when I looked at it. It didn't speak to me in any way. And I wasn't captivated by it. I wasn't particularly impressed.
Janice noticed that none of the other visitors seemed particularly awestruck either.
As I recall, there were only one or two other people in the chapel. They seemed to be either disinterested or, at the very least, unaware of what they were actually seeing.
But even so, Janice's interest was piqued to find out more.
I looked in the gift shop in the cathedral. The only thing I could find was a small brochure that had been rather poorly translated from Spanish into English.
It didn't say much, but reading the booklet, Janice began to discover a little more about the chalice's history. She was hardly the first to be drawn into the mystery of the Holy Grail.
The interest in chalices emerges from a desire to come in contact with something that had actually come in contact with the body of Christ.
For centuries, Grail hunters from all over the world have been searching for this miraculous object.
It symbolizes redemption, it symbolizes salvation, it symbolizes eternal life. And in a way, the Holy Grail stands for man's quest for God, man's quest for truth.
The Holy Grail in the Middle Ages became the motif of a lot of legends and romances and poetry, became the symbol of the aspiration of any Christian knight to go on a quest for the Holy Grail.
It's this incredible holy object that you search for on a great quest. It represents chastity and purity.
Along the way, it has become shrouded in myths and mystical powers.
It heals wounds, it offers salvation.
So much so that even at the height of the Nazi regime, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, searched for the Grail, believing its powers would help win him the war. He converted a great castle into a modern-day Camelot, with a ritual chamber and its own round table. He planned to display the Grail here, but he too failed in his quest.
It's become the one object in the world that is almost impossible to attain. It's become a symbol of something far beyond human aspirations, the absolute pinnacle of what we desire.
So over the centuries, the Grail has received many associations. Everything from St. Joseph of Arimathea and Glastonbury, King Arthur and his knights, the Templars, and more recently, Dan Brown, Indiana Jones, Monty Python. But essentially, beneath all these stories and myths is this idea of a cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper, the night before he was crucified.
So could this object in Valencia be the true cup of Christ? That same one everyone has been searching for? Janice's research showed whether this was or wasn't the real Grail, people had been prepared to die for it.
I found a very small booklet that had been written by Olmos Canalda. Now, he was a Spanish priest who was actually responsible for saving this chalice from destruction during the Spanish Civil War.
In the 1930s, Spain was a deeply divided country, politically torn between right-wing nationalist and left-wing Republican parties. As the Great Depression hit, the country fell into turmoil. After the king abdicated, the Republicans were elected to power and the army rebelled. Spain was in a state of civil war. And like all civil wars, atrocities were committed by both sides.
It was a time of great violence and strife, and it's often forgotten that the church itself had a very difficult time. It was persecuted. 13 Spanish bishops were put to death at the hands of the communists.
Many churches were desecrated, plundered, things stolen, reliquaries stolen, priests and nuns and religious killed by the communists who had a hate against the church, which was a symbol for the ancient regime.
In this climate, there was no respect for relics. Valencia and the chalice were in danger. At 9 a.m. on the 21st of July 1936, 4 people celebrated Mass with the Holy Chalice for the last time.
As they said Mass, hordes of soldiers began to surround the cathedral. They were very concerned. One priest locked and bolted the doors. At 10 o'clock, they felt the situation was so serious that they came up with a very dangerous plan. There just happened to be one woman in attendance at this Mass named Maria Sabina Sway. So they asked her to carry out this rather dangerous mission. They enveloped the chalice in silk, wrapped it in a newspaper, and planned to smuggle it out.
Sneaking through the church crypt, she carried her precious parcel beneath her coat. She had to walk through groups of armed soldiers. At any moment, they could discover her hidden treasure. But luck was on her side. Her brave action was just in time.
They entered the chapel of the Holy Grail. They burned all the pews and confessionals. They even burned the tabernacle where it had been kept. The fire was so intense that many paintings and precious works of art were destroyed.
But despite the destruction, the chalice had escaped. When the war finally ended, On March the 30th, 1939, it was brought out of its hiding place in the countryside and returned to the authorities in Valencia, where the chalice has remained in the cathedral ever since.
That story really impressed me, so much so that I felt that even if this weren't the real Holy Grail, I didn't feel it would be a waste of time to investigate it because it was so deserving of having its story told by its own merits.
But the key question for Janice was, if this was the real Grail, how had it got from the Holy Land in the 1st century to 21st century Spain?
Well, of course, it was very important for me to trace the story of this chalice from the beginning. You know, how did it get from Jerusalem to Spain?
Janice needed to work out how the cup might have left Jerusalem in the first place.
Establishing the authenticity of any object that supposedly goes back to Jesus, whether it be the chalice, the cross, the nails, is incredibly difficult, and it requires an awful lot of detective work.
So Janice focused on the events following the Last Supper. Going back to the earliest traditions of the Church, she discovered St. Peter was said to have gone from Jerusalem to Rome, where he became the first pope.
Well, we believe that St. Peter was made the head of the church by Jesus himself. He's given the name Peter, which means rock. He is the rock on which the church is built.
Janice felt it likely that because of his importance in early Christianity, St. Peter would have been given the cup and taken it to Rome.
Certainly, something as precious as the cup used by Jesus at that Last Supper surely would have been saved in some way, surely would have been passed down, and St. Peter is the likely sort of person who might end up with it.
She believed he would have then used this cup to celebrate the first Eucharist.
Christians felt that relics were extremely important because they were really a link between past and present. They represented something that was sacred, something beyond human comprehension.
But the fact that it could have been given to St. Peter was hardly proof. She needed to find more evidence. She looked into the earliest traditions of the Eucharist and discovered that when the Mass was codified, it had a very particular form of words.
In the Roman Catholic Mass, you have two different versions of the consecration. You have the general canon and the Roman canon. And the Roman canon says, not Christ took the cup in his hands, but it says, hunc preclarem calicem, what means this very chalice.
By saying this very chalice, did it mean that when the popes celebrated Mass then, they were using the actual Holy Grail from the Last Supper? Janice believed what is just tradition now was based on actual facts back then.
The Roman canon of the Mass are the words that Jesus spoke at the Last Supper. It originated in Rome with St. Peter and his followers, his successors. So many scholars would believe that this was the actual cup that had been used by Christ and that the popes were very well aware of that fact.
But 200 years after St. Peter may have brought the cup to Rome, disaster struck. Janice discovered that in 257, the Emperor Valerian instigated a systematic persecution of Christians. The bishops of Rome and Carthage were both beheaded, and the Bishop of Toulouse was tied to the tail of a bull and had his brains bashed out.
The Valerian persecution, I think there was more of an effort to just, well, literally, in every sense, decapitate the church. So take the leaders, just kill them by decapitation. Straightforward execution, you know. This is what will happen to you if you carry on in your insane, eccentric religious beliefs.
The Pope at the time was Sixtus II. Knowing he will be executed, the one thing he can do is preserve the cup. Janice read how he summoned a deacon of the church, a Spaniard called Lawrence, and asked him to safeguard the treasure. But the question was, had the Grail been part of those treasures?
So just on a whim, I started flipping through the files, hoping maybe I could find something about the life of St. Lawrence that might mention the fact that he had actually sent this cup of the Last Supper to Spain.
Janice then continued her research and came across an amazing discovery. A copy of a 17th century manuscript containing material she'd never seen before on the life of St. Lawrence.
This I felt was so significant that I ordered copies of the entire manuscript, had them sent to my home in the United States, and began to translate them.
Janice Bennett had discovered the manuscript of Abbot Donato. It told how Pope Sixtus had given the Grail to Lawrence, who, after defying the might of Rome, was put to death in the most horrific manner.
He was placed on a gridiron, having been stripped naked, and he was slowly roasted to death. But such was St. Lawrence's faith and courage that he was able to make light of the situation and even jest as he was being roasted on that gridiron. And he even said at one stage, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side."
But critically, Janice learned from the manuscript that before Lawrence died, he too had passed the chalice on to a fellow Spaniard.
Donato is very explicit. He says, and he gave to Priscillius, a co-disciple from the homeland of Spain, the cup in which Christ consecrated his blood on the night of the Last Supper. So here we have this direct, very explicit reference that also provides the name of the Spaniard to whom Lawrence entrusted such an important relic.
So the chalice had escaped with Priscillius, and Janice was building a strong case for Lawrence, getting the Grail to Spain.
According to tradition, he managed to get a Spanish soldier, a legionnaire from Spain, to carry this relic to Huesca, where the parents of St. Lawrence had an estate. So it was kept by the parents, and it was safe there.
So could the chalice have been taken to Huesca, a town in northeastern Spain? Janice traveled there and discovered at first hand how strong the cult of St. Lawrence remains there today. Further evidence linking the Grail to Spain.
In Huesca, it is so evident the importance that St. Lawrence has had for the people for so many years, that this tradition is so deeply enrooted in their culture that the entire town seems to be dedicated to him. I mean, you see these martyrdom motifs everywhere. 3 churches dedicated to St. Lawrence. Really, it's amazing.
But if the chalice had been taken to Huesca, it was there that the trail went cold. And what's more, This coincided with the greatest period of turmoil and religious conflict in Spanish history, the Muslim invasion.
I think it was safe then in a way, Scott, but the problem was that the Muslims came up from Africa and invaded Spain in the year 711. So at that time, Christians were really forming caravans all over Spain, going to the mountains in the northern parts to hide all the relics because they knew that they weren't safe.
For the next 250 years, there was no mention of the Holy Grail. But then, the records say that in 1037, it reappeared in a secluded monastery high in the Pyrenees.
I think the first time I went to San Juan de la Peña, I was immediately struck by this location. An absolutely magnificent monastery, very simple, but in such an incredible setting in the Pyrenees that it really invokes awe.
San Juan de la Peña was an important strategic location, a burial place of Spanish kings and a safe haven for relics.
A good part of northern Spain stayed Christian throughout this entire process, and that remained a stronghold and the point of resistance against Muslim occupation.
We know the chalice was here in 1037 because of a remarkable historic event.
It was the place where the first Mass in Latin language was celebrated in 1037 at a council where the Roman Mass was introduced into Mozarabic Spain. So when the papal delegate introduced and celebrated for the first time the Roman Mass, he consecrated with this important relic.
After the cardinal had used the Holy Cup of the Last Supper in the celebration of the Mass, San Juan de la Peña became a center for pilgrimage.
So there were thousands of people every year passing by. They liked to tell their stories of the relics along the way. And so the knowledge of this relic became very well known throughout Europe.
However it had got there, from this point on, the cup was hugely venerated on this site as the Holy Grail. Janice believed she had found a firm trail of evidence, taking the chalice from Jerusalem to Rome and now to the north of Spain. She now needed to discover how it got to Valencia. Janice read that after centuries safely stored in the remote monastery of San Juan de la Peña, the Grail was on the move once again. Reading the monastery's records, she discovered how, on September the 26th, 1399, the cup she had seen in the Cathedral of Valencia was handed over by the monks as a gift to the king.
It sets forth all the details of this transfer, of how he took it to his palace, the Aljaferia in Saragossa. And he mentions the fact that this is the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper and that it was sent to Spain by St. Lawrence.
From then on, she found out that successive monarchs kept the Grail with them, and it moved about their royal courts from Zaragoza to Barcelona, and then finally, Valencia.
And you see it is moving more and more south because during the centuries, the front between the Christian knights and the Muslims moved more and more to the south until in 1492, Spain was completely Christian again.
By 1428, the chalice was in the Cathedral of Valencia, where it has remained ever since. For Janice, it was all coming together. Finally, she believed she had tracked the complete journey of the chalice from Jerusalem to Valencia. But it was now that the difficult questions began. It could conceivably have been a cup that had come from Rome, but that didn't mean it was the cup of Christ used at the Last Supper, proving that would be much more difficult.
I did most of the work at home, of course. I would have copies of everything made in the National Library or wherever I found them, or when possible, I bought the books themselves and brought them home with me so that I could do it in my own home and piece everything together that way. I took many photographs along the way so that I would have that record as well.
Amongst the problems she faced were the many rival grails.
Well, we believe that by the 16th century, there were at least 20 chalices or other objects that claimed to be the Holy Grail.
There are three well-known grails today. The Genoa chalice, now proven to be a glass dish of Islamic origin.
Then we have the Antioch chalice, which is a beautiful silver work with a lot of decoration and human figures around. But the human figures alone prove that it must be Byzantine, because in Judaism, human figures were forbidden.
And if the Antioch chalice was too recent, then the wooden Nantius cup, with no provenance before the 19th century, was no contender either. One by one, Janice ruled out the pretenders. But how could she prove that the cup in Valencia was the real one? The solution had to be in proper archaeological testing.
For one thing, the object needs at least to be intrinsically plausible. So it needs to be something that does come from the 1st century, or at least plausibly comes from the 1st century, is something that somebody like Jesus, a Jewish peasant from Galilee, might have had, or his sponsors or friends might have had.
Janice discovered that the only detailed independent scientific analysis done on the chalice was by Dr. Antonio Beltran in the 1960s.
Professor Beltran was the professor at the University of Zaragoza, a leading Spanish archaeologist who, in the 1960s, was commissioned by the Archbishop of Valencia to study the relic of the Santo Cáliz from an archaeological point of view and to date it.
A prolific academic author and one of Spain's leading archaeologists, Beltran was also an expert on artwork of the ancient world.
Dr. Beltran felt that he didn't have to worry about whether or not it was authentic, that he could just proceed without concern about what the church would think if he saw that this wasn't possible to have been on the table of the Last Supper.
Dr. Beltran's findings were startling. He stated that the chalice was made up of 3 distinct parts: the base, the stem, and the upper cup, and they were all from different periods. The gold work linking the base to the upper cup was the most recent.
At a certain point, probably in the 14th century, those 2 stone elements are put together. The gold work seems very much in keeping with what gold work is in Spain in the 14th century.
If you see the golden frame, this is clearly medieval work. There's no question about it.
Dr. Beltran said the base was made of chalcedony stone. He concluded it was probably an inverted incense burner, chosen as a base to support the cup because of its similarity in color and material. But its design and poor quality of craftsmanship indicated it was possibly from as late as the 9th century, and so couldn't have anything to do with the true Grail. Beltran then focused all his attention on the upper cup. It too was made from chalcedony, but exquisitely crafted and of a very high quality, similar to those made at a very specific period of time.
And he dated it into the Hellenistic period, 3rd to 1st century before Christ. And you can prove it very easily that this dating is correct by just comparing it with other archaeological discoveries from this period.
And there was more than it just dating from the right period. According to Beltran, the upper cup was a great example of a luxury stone item from the skilled workshops of the Eastern Mediterranean, the very area Jesus Christ came from.
He said that these stone cups were fabricated in workshops in Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean, that they were actually very common in Greek and Roman times, and that they were used on luxurious tables. They were almost entirely made of hard stone, like chalcedony, and they were very expensive to make.
Critically, these valuable vessels stopped being manufactured around 50 AD, when they were replaced by glassware, which was cheaper and quicker to produce. So according to Beltran, the upper cup is definitely of the right design and type, from the right place and period. But trying to tie a specific object to a specific moment in history, like the Last Supper, is almost impossible.
There's no way to prove scientifically it was the cup of Christ. But what you can prove is that there is a possibility that it was used by Christ.
To try and find that proof, Janice went back to the historical context of the Last Supper. Could this have been the type of cup Jesus might have used?
Jesus was Jewish, and the chalice of the Last Supper was used for a Seder, for a Passover meal.
The Bible tells how in the last week of his life, Jesus went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Passover. Passover is one of the most important festivals in the Jewish year. At this time, Jewish people remember how God liberated them from slavery under the pharaohs in ancient Egypt. In preparation for the Passover meal, everything must be thoroughly cleansed or koshered. Anything porous or with cavities that cannot be ritually purged isn't used. So the chalice used for wine at the Last Supper had to have been pure. This would have ruled out wood and other materials.
They also did not use a clay chalice, because clay might have had little captivities in it. They did not use silver, because silver was used for pagan coins, and you had pagan deities imprinted on it.
Stone was the obvious answer.
You find stone vessels all over the Holy Land in Jewish settlements from the time of Christ, in which they kept water for purification. So the perfect choice would have been a stone vessel. And indeed, the Holy Grail in Valencia is a stone vessel made out of beautiful agate.
It was the type of cup that would have been used at such a celebration because it was hard, it was non-porous.
But this sheer craftsmanship and quality presented an entirely new problem. How could Jesus, who famously wanted nothing to do with wealth and riches, be using such a valuable cup? Once again, Janice looked to the Bible for clues. Looking back at the accounts of the Last Supper, in the book of Mark, she discovered that the Last Supper was held in a cenacle or dining room. And there was something unusual about this room.
According to Christians and many biblical scholars, the owner of the cenacle was a wealthy man. And we know that because it insinuates that in the Bible, that this was held in an upstairs room. There were servants present.
At that time, having a house with a first floor and servants would imply considerable wealth. If she is right, Jesus was an honored guest of a wealthy family. And on an occasion as special as Passover, it is likely that only the very best tableware would have been used.
So it was natural, because this was a very expensive cup. It would have been priceless for this family even before the Last Supper took place.
So if the upper cup was the type of cup used at the time, it begged the final question. Why had it been joined with medieval goldwork and studded with jewels? Janice discovered that embellishing relics was a popular practice in the Middle Ages.
Obviously, it stands to reason if you've got something incredibly holy, why not make it holier? I mean, you want to give people their money's worth when they come and see it, so deck it up in gold and jewels, whatever you've got to hand. There's a cynical element to that, of course. You know, it is effectively a tourist attraction. But there's also a more spiritual dimension as well. After Constantine, suddenly Christianity becomes a bit more worldly, and there's a greater sense of beauty as a spiritual path. So studying beauty would lead you to the true beauty, that is God. And Christians were quite enthusiastic about this.
But she also discovered there was a practical reason for the cup's transformation into a long-stemmed chalice.
It is easier to celebrate Mass when you have a stem to hold on to and a weighted base. There's less chance of an accident happening during the Mass, about spilling some of the precious blood.
For Janice, it was all making sense.
As all these pieces started coming together for me, I was really amazed by the incredible mosaic of art, culture, and history that was taking shape before my eyes.
From a valued family heirloom blessed by Jesus at the Last Supper, the Grail traveled to Rome and was used by the early popes to establish and practice the Holy Mass. During the Valerian persecutions, this same cup was bravely spirited away to northern Spain, where it had become a rallying point for Christianity. And then from the 14th century, it became a prized treasure of the kings of Aragon, before entering Valencia's cathedral in 1428, where it has remained almost ever since.
It really had all the makings of being one of the greatest stories in the history of humanity.
"11 years after first seeing the chalice, Janice was now convinced that the cup in the Cathedral of Valencia is the Holy Grail.
Really, this whole quest for me, I feel sometimes like I was led on it, that it was from something beyond me, because I have no idea how it happened.
She wrote up all her findings in the form of a book, St. Lawrence and the Holy Grail, the story of the Holy Chalice of Valencia.
It's really now for the first time that people who go to the cathedral and enter the chapel of the Holy Grail can actually appreciate the rich history of this relic, that they can understand all the sacrifices that were made by so many people throughout the centuries, that they can really comprehend all the near misses with destruction this relic has suffered throughout the years, and appreciate its history more.
Of course, it is impossible to say for certain that this is the Holy Grail. There are many skeptics who are sure it isn't, and to a large degree, it comes down to circumstantial evidence.
I guess the Valencia story is as plausible as any is for the last resting place of the Holy Chalice. The problem is it has a whole bunch of weak links. We have to accept that it was kept. We have to accept that it was taken to Rome. We have to accept that the story of Lawrence taking it to Spain is actually true. And we have to accept that, well, they did manage to hang on to it in Spain for all that time. But there's nothing impossible about any of them. You know, we don't need to believe in any miracles for this to be true. So it's possible.
For the faithful, the archaeological evidence doesn't refute the authenticity of the chalice, so no one can rule it out as the Holy Grail. And there are people in Spain who certainly believe it is authentic.
So the chalice is a wonderful link with the past, in the present. It keeps tradition alive. Often it is very important in defining identity, the identity of a particular town or a church or a province. And it does help to unlock the mysteries of our faith, to bring home to people things that happened way back in the biblical past.
In more recent times, the Valencia chalice has become more widely accepted. It seemed to have even received the endorsement of the highest Catholic authority.
In recent years, there have been 2 papal visits to Valencia.
The first was by Pope John Paul II in 1983.
He venerated the Holy Chalice, he touched it. And there's a wonderful picture of him kissing the chalice, and then a bit later he was able to use it at the celebration of Mass. And if we are to believe that this was the custom of the popes in the early centuries of the Church, then it was very much a return to papal custom, papal tradition, and the first time in over 1700 years that the Pope had used that chalice for Mass. It's nice to believe that anyway.
The second papal visit was in 2006, when Pope Benedict XVI also celebrated with the Holy Chalice.
On the square in front of the cathedral, he called it the famous relic of the Santo Calice, which was very important because it was a recognition of the relic status. It was not only a symbol, but indeed a relic.
Pope Benedict's choice of words, this most famous chalice, from the Roman canon, seemed to support the tradition of the Holy Chalice of Valencia without actually authenticating it. But for some of the faithful, the question whether it is or isn't real doesn't matter. What is much more important is the meaning behind the quest for the Grail.
So in a way, the Holy Grail has become bigger than simply an old cup that Jesus may or may not have used at the Last Supper. It really symbolizes something at the very heart of our human life.
For people, for Christians all over the world, this represents salvation. It represents the sacrament of the Eucharist, something beyond this world, something that we can look forward to when we die, a better place where everyone will be happy.
Today, this most famous chalice remains on show in Valencia's great cathedral for all to see, a focal point for belief and worship.
We have to really admire and look at the faith of many, many generations. And in a way, the devotion of generations of Christians gives a relic a certain sanctity in itself. The fact that it's been the focus of prayer, that it's been the means of people encountering God, whether or not the relic is historically valid, that in itself gives a certain authenticity to the relic.
In Rome, deep in the heart of the Vatican, they say there is an amazing object.
It becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Not a painting or icon, but a true image of Jesus Christ. It is called the Veil of Veronica.
The Veronica was believed to be a piece of fabric that touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image.
Venerated for over 1,000 years, this was once the most prized relic in Christendom and an object of pilgrimage. But one man has a shocking revelation. He believes the object in the Vatican is a fake. And he knows because he's found the real one. This is the story of Paul Badder's journey of discovery to find what had happened to the true face of God.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
If he is right, his discovery could have huge implications for the history of the Church and for the future of Christianity itself.
It was the first time for around 500 years that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ.
The story began at a dinner in Turin when journalist and author Paul Badder met German art historian Professor Heinrich Pfeiffer. Father Pfeiffer told Paul an amazing tale that, if true, could rewrite history, be the most significant discovery in Christianity, and show how what was once one of the most venerated objects in the Vatican could be a fraud.
I raised my glass to him and thought he must have been crazy.
The story revolved around a fabulous relic, the Veil of Veronica, whose origins are immortalized in most churches as the so-called sixth station of the cross. The stations of the cross take us through Christ's last terrible journey to his execution.
Every church has these images that we call the Stations of the Cross, and that allows us to accompany Jesus as he makes his way from his condemnation to death by Pontius Pilate right up to the moment of crucifixion and his burial.
Step by step, the stations tell the tale of the horrific suffering Jesus faced in the lead-up to his death.
He was scourged and crowned with thorns before he carried the cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem.
Along the way, Jesus is met by friends and supporters who share in his pain and suffering. One of them was said to be a woman known as Veronica.
A pious woman of Jerusalem saw Christ suffering and bleeding and sweating, and she took her sweat cloth, which was a cloth she was wearing around her head, and gave it to him to dry his face from blood and sweat.
The legend has it that when Christ handed the cloth back to her, miraculously, an image of his face had transferred to the material. But it is only a story. Veronica herself is not actually mentioned in the Bible.
The legend of Veronica is moving us because it is a legend of compassion and love and a miracle. And it allows us to have an image of Christ.
Whatever its actual origin, stories of a cloth bearing a miraculous image of Christ, not made by human hands, continued to circulate throughout the early Christian period.
There's a whole interconnected network of legends about a miraculous image of Jesus' face, which seem to come from different sources and have different motivations behind them.
Somehow, this miraculous cloth with its image of Christ made its way to Rome.
The first documented evidence of the Veronica being in Rome is from 705, when Pope John VII built a shrine for the Veronica.
By 1200, the Veronica was on permanent display in St. Peter's Basilica, and thousands of people flocked to see it. This image became hugely important to the world of art. Until then, artists had no idea of what Jesus actually looked like. There are no clues in the Gospels, so they depicted him in an idealistic or general way.
There are images of Jesus in the catacombs and elsewhere from the 2nd and 3rd centuries where Jesus just looks like a normal young Roman man, clean-shaven, a bit plump. You can only identify him by the fact that he's performing a miracle, and he's normally doing it in the way that a Roman god would do. So, for example, he's curing someone by touching them with a stick.
But when the Veronica appeared, all that changed. Now, artists and worshippers could look at an actual image of a real face.
It was very visual, and especially in the Middle Ages, the visual side of the faith was tremendously important. Having this imprint of Christ's face was almost as good as having a photograph.
You had an idea how God, who became man, really looks. God was not an idea, it was a face. God got a face, a human face.
This same face was seen and copied by many of the great artists and appeared in more and more works. It became the model for Jesus. The characteristics are always the same: the parted hair, the thin beard, the nose and mouth.
The Veronica was copied widely, and the simplified image of Christ's face was distributed across the world.
In fact, this image became so popular that a whole guild of specialist artists was created just to meet the demand.
From the middle of the 14th century, you get really clear evidence for people who are reproducing the Veronica and reproducing the holy images of Rome and selling those on as copies, but copies which bear the same spiritual authority and miracle-working power that the original did.
The Veronica proved not only a potent symbol, but also a great source of revenue as an object of pilgrimage.
The Veronica becomes a very important relic in Rome, that there's a chapel dedicated to it in St. Peter's. It soon becomes even the symbol of pilgrimage to Rome. So it becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Successive popes used the Veronica to increase their prestige and influence.
Innocent III is particularly interested in promoting the Veronica, in part to promote the city of Rome itself and to encourage the pilgrimage to Rome.
Pope Innocent III granted indulgences for those who prayed before the Veronica, gave it its own feast day, and even promenaded it around the city.
The highlight of the Holy Year was the showing of the Veronica, because this was the encounter with Christ on earth when we were still alive.
Eventually, the Veronica became big business. Numbers visiting Rome became so vast that the decision was made to tear down the old Basilica of St. Peter's and rebuild it.
One of the ways in which popes of the early Renaissance proclaimed their authority and created their legacy was through major building projects. And St. Peter's is a good example of a Renaissance pope crafting his legacy with an oversized building project.
Dominating the center of this magnificent new basilica is the altar, which according to tradition was built above the tomb of St. Peter.
And then around it, they have these 4 pillars where they place the relics which were so popular in the Middle Ages: the head of St. Andrew, the veil of Veronica, the Holy Lance, and also part of the true cross. And each of these relics, in a sense, being a cornerstone, a pillar of this new Basilica of St. Peter's, the heart of the church.
In other words, the Veronica had become one of the great pillars of the Catholic Church. But then Rome entered a dark period of disruption and violence, and everything changed. On the 6th of May, 1527, Rome was looted and attacked, ironically, by the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor.
The sack of Rome was a catastrophe for the Roman Church. For 1,000 years, Rome was a safe place, where all the pilgrims and the kings and the emperors who came to Rome left important donations at St. Peter.
In an orgy of violence, 500 men were slain in front of the altar, and many of the relics it had housed disappeared.
According to the contemporary reports, the most important relics were given away in a pub, and drinking soldiers were drying their mouth with the veil of Veronica.
In time, the dust settled, and the new St. Peter's Basilica was finally completed and consecrated. But by then, something had obviously changed. Although the Vatican still claimed to have the Veronica safe, it was no longer on public display. And on the rare occasions when it was shown, it seemed to look different.
Suddenly, the Veronica was not a clear, shiny image anymore, but a dark cloth with some traces of blood.
It led some to wonder if the original face of God had been lost.
So the big question is, what happened to the original Veronica, the beautiful Veronica, which was painted by the painters in the Middle Ages? It disappeared. And here we have the discovery of Father Pfeiffer.
At the dinner in Turin, Father Pfeiffer outlined his theory to Paul Bader, that the real face of God was no longer in the Vatican. Paul was skeptical. He had been warned of Pfeiffer's fantastical claims before. But Father Pfeiffer went further, claiming he knew where the real Veronica was now. 120 miles away, in a small town called Manapello.
He said, yes, there is something quite unknown on a little remote hilltop in the Abruzzi Mountains. He said, how come the whole world doesn't know of it? He said, yeah, that's a mystery. And, he made it even more mysterious. And so it was just completely unbelievable.
Paul dismissed the whole theory.
I thought it's a fine story, but that was it. I wasn't even curious about it.
But this chance meeting would prove to be a turning point in Paul's life. Some months later, whilst traveling with his daughter down the Adriatic coast, Paul found himself near Manapello, and the church that Father Pfeiffer had claimed was the home to the real Veronica.
Then we got there and I thought it was about lunchtime, so maybe we could have a little lunch up there and have a look at it.
The town of Manapello, nestled within the mountainous region of Abruzzo, is in a remote area, off the beaten track, and largely forgotten by the outside world.
We got off the highway, the restaurant was closed, and I got here to the church.
Walking into the church, Paul saw the image for the first time.
The church had a mass, and after the mass I got up there, and this image was just, he looked at me.
Paul was immediately struck by the eyes, the gaze of Christ on this transparent image.
Seeing somebody's face is really seeing the person. You know, looking into somebody's eyes, looking at their expression, we can learn so much about that person. We believe that God became man in Jesus Christ, and to be able to see that face as it existed in his humanity, it would be a wonderful link with the divine nature.
Paul noticed that the material was so fine that in certain light, the image almost vanished, only returning when illuminated by a torch.
It's constantly exposed. And you can walk nearby, you can walk around, you can take pictures from any direction, and you can see how the light from the many windows in the church go through it. You can put your hand behind it, you can see your hand. You can put a newspaper behind it, and you can read the newspapers because it is so thin and so fine. And when you get very close to it, you see that the image itself is translucent. You don't see any color.
Paul could have gazed at the image forever, but was pressed for time.
My daughter, she was very impatient. She said, let's get off, I'm hungry, let's have something to eat. So she dragged me away, but I had to look at it one more time. And then he looked at me as if somebody who would just be awakening.
Deeply affected, but not sure of what he'd just seen, Paul couldn't bring himself to believe it was the real thing. And after leaving, put it to one side. Two years passed, and after working abroad as the Jerusalem correspondent for the German daily newspaper Die Welt, Paul returned to Rome. It was here that the Veronica reappeared in his life once again.
So, around the corner, I saw a little poster announcing, not a press conference, a lecture of a certain Pater Pfeiffer. So that's my Pater Pfeiffer. So I have to see him. I have to see him again. I have to see what he's going to tell me about the image.
Father Heinrich Pfeiffer is a German Jesuit scholar specializing in medieval religious art.
Father Pfeiffer is one of the leading art historians of the Christian world. A highly educated man and very important art historian.
During the course of the lecture, Father Pfeiffer reiterated his claim that the Manipello image is the Veil of Veronica. During the talk, Paul was struck by the detail in the magnified close-ups. Seeing them brought a sudden revelation. It was real, and he believed in it.
I thought, this is it. It must be, everything must be true, but these images, there's no comparison to it. I hadn't seen photos like this before.
He was so fascinating, but it became the mission of his life to spread the message of the human image of God around the world.
Paul was desperate to tell the world about these miraculous images and write a book, but he knew how hard it would be to convince people. It was a formidable challenge. He would need a lot of evidence to win over skeptics. The first question is, how can there even be a face displayed in Manipello if there is already a Veil of Veronica in the Vatican?
Every year on Passion Sunday at 5 p.m., you can see what today is venerated in St. Peter as the Veronica, because the canons of St. Peter's appear on the balcony and bless the faithful with the modern-day Veronica, which is in a huge, heavy silver frame. But you can't see a human face.
Drawing on all his Roman contacts, he tried to secure a meeting with the Vatican authorities. Eventually, in summer of 2004, after much persistence, he was granted an audience with Professor Arnold Nesselrath.
He's the director of the Vatican Museums. He's a very prestigious position. He's a high respected person in the world of art.
Keen to learn the Vatican's angle on the Manopello image, Paul met with Professor Nesselrath. He eagerly showed him pictures of the Manopello face. And questioned the professor about what it could be. But Professor Nesselrath would not be drawn into the debate about the Manopello image.
He had heard something of it, and he had heard something of Pater Pfeiffer. And he was from the big front who had decided about Pater Pfeiffer that he's not to be taken serious.
Professor Nesselrath would neither lend any credence to the Manopello image, nor let Paul see the Vatican's Veronica. When pressed to go and examine the image in Manopello for himself, the professor declined, claiming it was beyond his jurisdiction. The official channels had got him nowhere. He needed a different approach for his investigation. If he can't see the Vatican's image, he needed to find out more about the one in Manopello. When had it arrived, and how had it got there?
The problem with something like the image of Manopello is that there just isn't a paper trail, basically. So we know this object has been here in Manopello for a certain amount of time. We know that it arrived there under certain circumstances, but before that, who knows, basically. There's just no way of telling.
Paul realized that if it is real, then the most likely time for its arrival in Manopello would have been around 1527, during the sack of Rome. And there seemed to be a link. Paul's research showed that Pope Clement took refuge in the Castle Sant'Angelo after the sack of Rome. Something as valuable as the Veronica wouldn't have been left behind. Whilst waiting for the looting to end, Paul thought it possible that the commander of the castle had it spirited away to safety, far from Rome. Intriguingly, the commander had an estate in Manopello, and it all seemed to make sense.
One very realistic perspective is what Bade believes in, that the Castello Sant'Angeli, who had land in Manopello, safeguarded it and brought it there to protect it.
But confusingly, there is another version of events.
In 1506, a stranger appeared in Manopello and gave it to a local. And this local wanted to ask questions, but suddenly the stranger disappeared and he believed he was an angel.
This didn't add up, as 1506 is 21 years before the sack of Rome. Paul then looked at what was happening in Rome during this period and discovered very little was written about the Veronica for 100 years after the sack of Rome, until the consecration of St. Peter's Basilica in 1626. Officially, the Veronica was still there, housed within one of the 4 famous pillars. But Paul discovered something puzzling. In 1629, Pope Urban VIII stopped the veil being displayed. The lucrative trade in copies was prohibited, and he demanded all existing copies be destroyed on pain of excommunication. It was as if someone was trying to hide something.
It was important to recall all the images of the Veronica which has disappeared, and to wait until it disappears from the memory of pilgrims and Christian faithful.
Paul discovered that the story of an angel bringing the image to Manopello first appeared during the time the images were being destroyed. When the Manopello image was scrutinized, 12 townspeople came up with the story that their face of God was brought to them by an angel, long before the sack of Rome. To Paul, now this story made sense. The villagers had used this tale to pretend their image couldn't possibly be of the real Veronica, and by doing so, had protected their image from destruction.
It was to disguise something. And then they invented a story, I mean, that an angel has brought it here, what you can do easily in Italy, because Italy is full of saints. Miracles are not strange to Italians.
Only after time had passed did the Vatican start showing the Veronica again. But it seemed different and much darker.
The replacement was not a good or bad copy, but something completely different. You had to destroy the original images and replace them by what you have. Later, the Vatican gave out new prints of the Veronica, which resembled what they have today. But this is a clear indication that the original relic disappeared and was exchanged.
The evidence for this can be found in art. Now, not only did it look completely different, so did the copies made by artists. It all seemed to suggest that the original had been lost. Paul was now certain that the original couldn't be in the Vatican, and that at some point the image was exchanged and a new one put in its place. But to prove that, he needed more evidence. He looked at early descriptions of the veil. In the past, it was recorded as being almost transparent. Even the Protestant reformer Martin Luther said it was like a translucent piece of linen. Unlike the blackened image in the Vatican, the Manopello image fitted that description.
There are many compelling reasons to think that that might be the case. The fact that the veil is transparent, that we can see through it, and we knew that was the case for the medieval Veronica.
Paul's attempts to see the Vatican's Veronica continued to be rebuffed. Thinking laterally, he decided to visit their vast treasury museum. He was looking for any evidence that would tie the Manopello image to Rome before 1527.
In the treasury of St. Peter's, there is a broken frame in which the Veronica was once kept. A frame that you could observe from both sides, just like in Manopello, and roughly the same dimensions.
For Paul, it was another clue. Only a transparent image that could be viewed from both sides would ever be displayed in this way.
To have a frame which is translucent only makes sense if you have a translucent cloth, like the veil of Manopello. The dimensions fit. And this is why we believe that the original Veronica, which was venerated in this frame, is what we today call the veil of Manopello.
If the true Veronica was still in the Vatican, why had this frame been smashed and the original cut away?
Taking all the information together which we have, there's no doubt about it. It must have been the sack of Rome.
Paul concluded it was the Manopello image that was torn from this smashed frame. The image even has a glass chip still embedded in it.
The whole story of this frame is giving even more credence to the theory of Professor Pfeiffer and Paul Bade that the true Veronica of the Middle Ages is a Manopello today.
It is a conflict about plausibility. If somebody comes up at the theory which is more plausible. I'm the first one to applaud it, the first one.
For Paul, the evidence linking the Manapello image to the original Veronica was conclusive. He was certain that they are one and the same. This now begged the biggest question of all. Could this really be the face of God? And if so, how had it been created? Paul went back to the original story and looked for clues. The problem is, Saint Veronica doesn't exist in the Bible.
One of the striking features of the Western version of the legend is the character of Veronica herself, a saint kind of created by clerical error, if you like. The name obviously derives from the Latin for the true icon, or Latin and Greek. The true image of Christ becomes the Vera Icone Veronica. You've invented a saint.
In other words, there never was a Veronica. Her name simply referred to the cloth itself.
The legend of Veronica was only one of many attempts to explain what we really have. But the name is revealing what we are talking about. Vera Iconia, the true image, was not the name of a woman, but the name of the image.
The implications of this are enormous. If Veronica did not exist, then the image could not have been created when she had wiped Jesus' face on the way to the crucifixion. So how did it get there? Paul examined the material itself and discovered how extraordinarily fine it was. It didn't look like linen or even silk. But what could it be? Researching on the internet, he came across an ancient fabric called byssus.
There are several types of byssus in antiquity, but the most precious one was created from the silk of a shell of a mussel. It's called Pinna nobilis. It's a very large Mediterranean mussel, 90 centimeters. Large thing.
Divers harvested byssus by hand. It took thousands of threads to make the smallest piece of silk. And as a result, it was extremely valuable. Byssus was so precious, it had long been revered as a religious material. Critically, it was used during the time of Christ.
It was the most precious fabric in the antique times. You find it in the graves of the pharaohs in Egypt. You find it in the cloth of the high priest, the ephod made of byssus. In the curtain of the temple, byssus was mentioned. It's mostly translated in English, for instance, shining linen.
But was the Manapello image made of byssus? Continuing his research, Paul tracked down a woman in Sardinia, the last mussel silk cultivator. He flew her to Manapello to see the image for herself.
We brought her here to the image of the veil. She got on her knees. She said, oh dear, that's byssus. That's mussel silk.
Byssus was far too valuable to have been used as something to mop up sweat. So how might the image have got there? Paul went back to the Bible to look for clues. After Jesus died, he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb with the different cloths needed for his burial. A shroud, to wrap the body and a veil to cover his face.
Everybody was expecting to do the final burial on Sunday morning. That's why the women returned to wash and clean and embalm the body. When they came, the body had disappeared. The tomb was empty. He was not there anymore, because he was not dead anymore. He had risen.
In John chapter 20, there's that wonderful description of Peter and John running to the empty tomb. They've just heard from the women that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and they go and investigate. The Gospels are very clear that when the disciples entered the empty tomb, there were various burial cloths lying around, not just the shroud, but amongst others, the cloth that was around the face of Christ.
Such a funeral veil would have been made of a fine, valuable material like byssus. Could it have been that whilst wrapped around Jesus' head, it had miraculously taken on the image of his face?
The Church clearly believes in the supernatural. It clearly believes in the miraculous. It clearly believes that the divine can work in the world. So it's certainly open to the possibility of images made without human hands. It was the image of a Christ who is alive, rather than the image that we find on the Shroud of Turin, the image of a dead man.
For the early Christians, it must have been a revelation that not only the body of the suffering Christ was imprinted on the burial cloth, but we also have the face of the resurrected Christ on a veil. And of course, both relics were venerated and given from generation to generation.
So could the Manopello image have been made by a miraculous process? Skeptics have often claimed that the Manopello image must just be a painting. But Paul discovered byssus has an unusual quality. You cannot dye or paint on it.
Paul Bade verified it is indeed not ordinary silk, but shell silk which you cannot paint. There are some very small pigments by medieval painters who try to refresh or to intensify colors in some points, or maybe even try to put fur images against it to get the replica blessed by the original. You call it second-class relic or relic by touch. But Paul Bade verified it is not a human being.
For Paul, all the pieces supporting his belief in the truth behind the Manopello image were fitting into place. From the Bible, he believed he had deduced what the cloth itself was used for.
Rather than being the cloth used by that pious woman as Jesus carried the cross, that it was actually one of the burial cloths of our Lord.
From paintings, he saw how the same image had been revered in Rome throughout the Middle Ages.
If you compare the Volto Santo of Manopello with all the paintings we have of the Veronica in Rome, they are identical. They're identical even in details.
And from the broken frame, he could see how it had been saved after the sacking of Rome and sent to Manopello, where it had been quietly forgotten for nearly 500 years.
It's so evident. This is the veil. There's no doubt about, I mean, you could rip my skin off. I mean, this is it.
For Paul Bade, the story of Manopello's face of God was almost complete, and he could start writing up his theory. After completing his research, he sent all his evidence along with photographs to Pope John Paul II. It had been an incredible journey.
I couldn't believe it, but the whole story. Every time and again, I had to pinch myself because it's a miraculous story.
Paul's work found a wide audience. Not only was it seen by Pope John Paul, but also by Cardinal Ratzinger, the leading authority on Catholic doctrine and thought, who complimented Paul on his work. And then, out of the blue on Sunday the 13th of March 2005, Paul Bader was granted an extraordinary opportunity to see the version of the Veronica in the Vatican. Making his way into St. Peter's, he was aware that this could be the final piece of the puzzle.
I don't know how come that I have seen it, that all of a sudden the doors opened, I could enter the column.
Within the Veronica column is a staircase leading to a small chapel housing the actual image itself.
Of course, Paul Bader has seen what they believe to be the Veronica in the Vatican right now and had the opportunity to see this relic from close by.
In the depths of the Veronica column, he finally saw the veil of Veronica. But it was a dark, unrecognizable image, nothing like the old artist's reproductions, and it was housed in a heavy, ornate picture frame. Clearly, this was a completely different image.
What I saw there, I saw a big silver frame. You see this hoax, that I might call it, or copy. Everything had disappeared.
He was even denied permission to photograph it. The Vatican have taken their own photos, but they are rarely shown.
The reason why they don't publish these pictures is they don't want to disappoint the faithful by revealing that there is no face on the Veronica anymore.
To this day, no pope has openly admitted that the Vatican Veronica ever disappeared, or that the barely visible face shown today is anything other than what had always been on display. But Paul had no doubt about what had really happened.
It was a trick. It was a trick from 500 years ago, from these times of Machiavelli.
Paul is certain that this trick or hoax was deliberately perpetrated to maintain the illusion that the Vatican still had the real one. But if this had happened hundreds of years ago, why not admit it now?
I think there's no question that having the Veronica in your church, if you happen to be the Pope, would be an incredibly useful asset. You know, it's an item of incredible holiness and power. Everyone is awestruck by it. You're going to get a lot of people coming to see it, and it shores up your power, effectively, as leader of the church.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
For Rome and her powerful popes, such a monumental loss of face would have been deeply embarrassing.
It's a catastrophe for the Church of Rome. We lost the face of God. Not the faith in God, but the face of God.
Paul thought there may have been another reason why the hoax was perpetrated. The Veronica had earned the church a lot of money.
They did not come to see St. Peter. They did not even come to see the Pope, as they do today. They wanted to see the veil.
Pilgrims had to be shown something, and that's just what happened. What started as a small hoax was simply allowed to continue until it became widely believed.
It's easy to dismiss it as just a cynical cashing-in exercise, and I'm sure it was partly a cynical cashing-in exercise. But it was also a way of making that pilgrimage real. I mean, remember, the whole idea of pilgrimage, at least in theory, is to take part in the physicality of something holy.
But others are more sympathetic about why the Veronica might have been replaced.
First of all, I have to disagree with both Father Pfeiffer and my dear friend Paul Bade in the idea that the canons of St. Peter perpetrated a hoax, a pious forgery, a pious fraud. I do not believe it. I believe they were hysterically searching for something and just took the second best and believed it because they wanted to believe it, that this is the right Veronica.
On April the 2nd, 2005, Pope John Paul II died. He was succeeded by the man who had complimented Paul on his book, Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI.
On the 1st of September 2006, Pope Benedict visited Manopello. Often he visited Italian shrines to venerate the relics or the local traditions. And there's that very evocative image of Pope Benedict just staring at the veil in Manopello. There's a real sense of an encounter, encountering face to face with Christ. He was clearly very moved.
For Paul, this was the justification for all his hard work.
When he came to Manopello for the first Pope, then he prayed here in silence. He bowed, he bent his knee in front of it, and then for more than 8 minutes he's been in silent prayer in front of it. I mean, it was very, very moving.
It was the first time, for we believe around 500 years, that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ, of the resurrected Christ.
Pope Benedict's visit changed everything.
A week later, on St. Peter's Square, next audience, he said, if we want to know who God is, then we only have to look into the face of his Son, and there we see who God is and how God is.
Although not actually authenticating the image, Pope Benedict's personal visit gave credibility to those that believed this was the true face of God.
He brought the image back into the world. That's what he did.
Paul and many of the faithful believe there is no doubting that this image is genuine. But there will always be skeptics. They want proper scientific evidence to show how the image got there and how old it is. The guardians at Manopello aren't against testing, as long as it is non-invasive and so doesn't damage the veil. They hope science will develop in the future, allowing for a more detailed examination which they are sure will vindicate their claims. If this happens, then the Veil of Veronica would become one of the most significant discoveries in Christian history.
Just as the Veronica was a very popular relic in the Middle Ages, we're now entering a new period, a revival of this interest in the Holy Face, searching for the face of God, searching for that personal encounter with him.
St. Paul wrote in his letters, if Christ did not resurrect, our faith is worthless. So the veneration of the Volto Santo is concentrating the attention of Christianity back onto the image of the resurrected Christ. And that's important.